Every organization eventually gets the same request: put every KPI on one page. And everyone nods because it sounds reasonable. Executives want clarity, they want speed, they want to know what's working and what's failing without sitting through interpretive dance in a quarterly business review. But that request is a mistranslation. They aren't asking for a prettier dashboard. They're asking for a deterministic decision surface. One place where the organization can't argue about definitions, can't hide in nuance, and can't delay action behind, "We need to analyze it more." The reason the request keeps coming back is simple. The system leaks meaning and trust. And when trust leaks, leaders ask for more visibility. Visibility won't fix it. Decision architecture will. If you're the person who has to defend decisions in audit meetings, post-incident reviews, or board prep, you already know the dirty secret. "We had a dashboard" is not a control, it's a screenshot. Subscribe if you want mental models and architectural patterns that survive contact with reality, governance, ownership, time constraints, and enforcement. Not feature tours, not click here. This show treats the Microsoft ecosystem like what it is: a distributed decision engine. You either design intentionally or you inherit accidentally. And inherited systems always drift. Now let's name the real problem hiding behind the KPI request. The KPI request as a symptom, data entropy in executive language. When an executive asks for all KPIs on one page, the comfortable interpretation is that they're impatient. The correct interpretation is that they're responding to entropy, not thermodynamics. Enterprise entropy, drift, duplication, conflicting truths, and the slow breakdown of shared meaning across systems. KPI proliferation is the classic coping mechanism. When the organization can't trust a small set of metrics, it starts collecting more. It adds a KPI for every argument. Every KPI becomes a political bandage over a system that can't produce a single coherent answer without a meeting. And over time, more KPIs turns into surveillance. Not because leadership loves monitoring, because trust failed, and surveillance is what people buy when they can't buy certainty. Here's the thing most people miss. The KPI request isn't about numbers. It's about the cost of disagreement. A metric that requires interpretation isn't a metric, it's a conversation starter. That sounds collaborative. It's also why decisions take weeks. The organization has to negotiate reality every time it wants to act. This is why dashboards fail even when the data is accurate. Accuracy doesn't create determinism. A perfectly accurate chart can still produce 5 different decisions depending on who's looking at it, what incentives they have, and which definition of the metric they quietly prefer. That variance is entropy in its most expensive form, decision latency. Decision latency becomes the company's real KPI, not because anyone tracks it, because it quietly dictates everything else: missed targets, reactive cost-cutting, delayed escalations, incident breaches that were visible days earlier but not acted on. You can't out-report latency. You have to design it out. And this is where the one-page idea gets interesting. Executives don't want a page, they want a control plane. They want one place where the organization's operational story is consistent and where the next action is not an emotional debate. So the request keeps returning because the system keeps leaking meaning. Let's make the leak concrete. One team calculates revenue one way because their source system stores credits and returns differently. Another team calculates it another way because they normalized it downstream. Finance reconciles both in Excel because that's where contradictions go to die quietly. Meanwhile, leadership is staring at a dashboard that is technically correct and strategically useless because nobody can commit to action without first committing to a definition. That's entropy, not missing data, competing truths. And it doesn't stay in finance. It does the same thing with incidents and SLAs. Severity gets negotiated after the fact. Tickets get reclassified. The clock gets paused by process loopholes. The dashboard faithfully reports the outcome of the loopholes. Everybody claims the SLA is fine, right up until a customer's lawyer forces honesty. The system didn't break. The system behaved like an ungoverned distributed environment. It optimized for local incentives, not global intent. This is the uncomfortable truth. Executives ask for more KPIs when they can't trust the existing ones to trigger action. Because in a healthy system, a KPI isn't an observation, it's an obligation. It encodes, when this happens, we do that. If a KPI doesn't change behavior, it's decoration with budget. And decoration breeds more decoration. More tiles, more conditional formatting, more gradients, more "can we add just one more metric?" Until the page is full and nothing happens faster. You see it in Power BI projects all the time. Someone builds an overview page, cards, colors, indicators because a video showed how to do it. The visual looks clean, everyone praises it. Then 2 weeks later, the same executive asks for the page again, but simpler, clearer, more actionable. They're not being difficult. They're telling you the page didn't reduce entropy. It just rendered entropy in high resolution. So treat the KPI request as a diagnostic. It's a symptom that the organization's decision system is probabilistic. Definitions drift, ownership is fuzzy, action pathways are negotiated in meetings, and nothing is enforced by design. That's what we're fixing in this episode. But first, you need a translation table, because executives are actually pretty consistent. They just don't speak architecture. What the boss says versus what the boss means. The translation table. Executives don't ask for architecture because they don't have to. They ask for outcomes. They ask for simplicity. They ask for a one-pager. Your job is to translate the request into the system requirement it implies, whether they know it or not. Because if you take the words literally, you'll build a dashboard and you'll get asked to rebuild it forever. So here's the translation table, not as a cute exercise, as a survival mechanism. When the boss says, I need everything on one page, they mean I need a single control plane, not a layout. A control plane is where definitions are enforced, states are tracked, and escalation is predictable. A page is just an interface. And interfaces lie with perfect confidence when the layers underneath disagree. If you give them 9 tiles and a slicer, you gave them visibility. You did not give them control. They will still need a meeting to decide what the tiles mean, whether they can be trusted, and who is on the hook when one turns red. When the boss says, make it simple, they mean remove interpretive freedom from critical metrics. They are not asking for fewer visuals. They're asking to stop paying the organization to argue. Simplicity in executive language means the system should not allow 10 competing definitions of revenue, margin, or SLA. It means the number should arrive with a contract. How it's calculated, what inputs it uses, what it excludes, and what action it triggers when it crosses a threshold. Most teams respond to make it simple by hiding complexity behind tooltips. That is not simplicity. That is camouflage. When the boss says just show red and green, they mean encode risk tolerance and trigger conditions. Red and green isn't about color, it's about thresholds that the organization commits to in advance. If the threshold isn't explicit, the color becomes performance art. Someone will always argue that it's only slightly red, or red but explainable, or red because the data's wrong. They don't want red, they want if it's red, the next action is already decided. That's the determinism they're reaching for, even if they can't name it. When the boss says we need this for the board, they mean we need audit-ready logic and lineage. Boards don't care about your gradients. Boards care about whether the numbers are defensible. And defensible doesn't mean you can talk fast in a meeting. It means you can show where the data came from, who approved the definitions, what changed, and why the decision that followed was consistent with policy. A board packet is not a report, it's a liability document. If the organization can't explain why a KPI moved and what it did about it, the board doesn't see insight. It sees unmanaged risk. When the boss says, can we drill down? They mean, can we resolve disputes without starting a new analytics project? Drill down is usually a euphemism for mistrust. It's the executive version of prove it. And it's reasonable, but if the only way to prove it is to spin up another analyst to build another page, you've built a dependency, not a decision system. In a decision engine, drill down is not exploration, it's traceability. Show the inputs that produce the decision, the constraints applied, and the state of the triggered action. That's how you end debates, not by adding more charts. When the boss says, just get it done by Friday, they mean, I will accept technical debt as long as it creates the illusion of control. This is the most dangerous one, because it's where good architects become accomplices. Friday deadlines produce one-page dashboards that look authoritative but are structurally unverifiable. They create the appearance of a control plane while adding another entropy generator underneath, a brittle semantic model, a manual refresh workaround, an Excel reconciliation step nobody documents. And then the deadline passes, the dashboard exists, and the organization pretends the problem is solved until it isn't. Here's the checkpoint. If you remember nothing else, remember this distinction. Executives speak in interface requests, but they want decision guarantees. They want the organization to behave consistently when conditions change. They want fewer meetings whose only output is, we'll monitor it. They want escalation without politics. So the KPI one-pager request is not a design brief, it's an architectural indictment. And the next trap is the one everyone falls into, confusing visibility with control. Visibility is not control. Dashboards as wallpaper charts. Dashboards are good at one thing, showing state. They are terrible at the thing executives actually need, forcing the organization to respond to that state consistently. That distinction matters because most companies confuse I can see it with I can control it. And they treat visibility like a control system when it's just telemetry. And telemetry without enforcement doesn't create reliability, it creates meetings. A report can tell you revenue is down, forecast variance is widening, and churn is creeping upward. Great, now what? If the what is a debate loop, who owns it, whether the metric is real, whether it's seasonal, whether the segment filter is fair, then you didn't build a KPI system. You built a discussion forum with better typography. This is why so many executive dashboards become wallpaper charts. They look authoritative, they feel like control, they create comfort, and then they sit there while nothing deterministically happens. The thing most people miss is that executives don't have time to become analysts, and they shouldn't have to. But dashboards quietly demand exactly that. They demand interpretation, they demand context reconstruction, they demand an understanding of the model, the refresh cadence, the exclusions, and the caveats, usually delivered verbally by the one person in the room who knows the data. That person becomes a single point of failure, and the organization calls that data-driven. Now here's where most people mess up. They try to fix this with interactivity. More slicers, more drill through, more bookmarks, more explore the data yourself. Interactivity doesn't reduce ambiguity, it often multiplies it, because now every executive can generate their own version of reality. One person filters by region, another filters by product. A third switches the date range. You get 3 screenshots in a Teams chat and a new argument about which one is the truth. Congratulations, you turned a static disagreement into a distributed one. In architectural terms, you converted a deterministic model, one chart, one view, into a probabilistic model, many views, many interpretations, no enforced conclusion. And the cost isn't theoretical. The hidden tax is decision latency. Decision latency is the time between we can see the problem and the organization actually changes behavior. Dashboards tend to optimize the first half and ignore the second. They make problems visible sooner, but they don't compress the response cycle unless you deliberately wire response into the system. So you end up with a company that is incredibly aware of its problems and still slow. That's why leadership keeps pushing for one page. They believe a tighter interface will compress time to decision, but time to decision doesn't come from layout. It comes from pre-commitment. The system has to answer these questions before the meeting starts. What condition counts as bad precisely? Who is accountable specifically? What action happens, automatically or by obligation? What time window exists before the risk compounds? Where is the state of that action tracked so it can't vanish into chat messages? A dashboard answers none of those. A dashboard is silent on ownership, silent on enforcement, silent on time, silent on whether anyone did anything. That's why executives get addicted to red, green indicators. They think they're simplifying. What they're really doing is begging you to encode a rule. They want the system to stop asking them to decide from scratch every week. Because if red only means we should discuss it, then red is not a signal. It's an invitation to stall. This is the core misconception. Visibility is observation. Control is obligation. And Microsoft's ecosystem, for all its branding, doesn't magically fix that. Power BI can visualize, Fabric can store, Purview can catalog, Copilot can talk. None of that creates control unless you design a decision path that is deterministic end to end. This is why we'll just build a scorecard often fails. It's still a report. It still ends in interpretation. It still terminates in humans deciding whether to care. It's governance theater. You can point at it in a deck, but it doesn't enforce intent at scale. So if you're the architect, stop treating the dashboard as the deliverable. The deliverable is the decision system behind it. The dashboard becomes a thin interface on top of rules, ownership, state, and execution. It's not the control plane. It's the window into the control plane. Once you accept that, everything else clicks. Because now the question stops being, how do we show all KPIs on one page? And becomes, which decisions must the organization make deterministically and what system will enforce them? Key. The foundational misunderstanding. KPIs are not metrics. KPIs are decision rules. The foundational misunderstanding is that organizations think a KPI is a fancy metric. It isn't. A metric is observation. It describes what happened. A KPI is obligation. It describes what must happen next. That distinction matters because the moment you treat KPIs as important metrics, you accidentally permit interpretation. And interpretation is where entropy breeds. Interpretation is where every stakeholder can look at the same number and negotiate a different meaning, a different excuse, and a different delay. Most dashboards are built on metrics. They show revenue, margin, pipeline, SLA, customer satisfaction, whatever. And then the organization asks humans to do the hard part. Decide whether it matters, decide who owns it, decide what to do, and decide how fast. That is not a control system. That is a weekly ritual where you pay senior people to improvise. A KPI in architectural terms is a rule that binds observation to a decision surface. It says, when this condition is true, the organization is no longer allowed to just notice. It is required to act or to formally declare an exception. This clicked for him after watching how KPI overview pages get praised and then quietly ignored. The visuals weren't the problem. The absence of enforcement was. A KPI without an action is not insight, it's decoration with budget. It's a card visual that makes people feel governed while the organization continues to behave however it wants. And once you accept that, you can start diagnosing KPI systems the same way you diagnose security systems, by checking whether they actually change behavior under pressure. Here's the uncomfortable test. If a KPI turns red and nothing happens until the next meeting, it's not a KPI. It's a mood indicator. If a KPI turns red and the first response is the data right? It's not a KPI. It's a trust problem wearing a number as a costume. If a KPI turns red and 5 people can claim partial ownership, it's not a KPI. It's a political object. A real KPI is what executives think they're buying when they ask for red and green. They think red means something is now in motion, not we will add it to the agenda. So redefine it properly. A metric answers, what is the value? A KPI answers, what are we going to do about that value? And who is obligated to do it and by when? That's why the same metric can exist for years without changing outcomes, then suddenly become transformative when you bind it to a decision rule. Nothing about the number changed, the obligation did. Now there's a second trap, and it's where naive KPI enforcement collapses into dysfunction, gaming. The moment you attach consequences to a number, people will optimize the number. Not the outcome. The system didn't become broken. It behaved like an incentive-driven distributed environment. It took the path of least resistance. That's why KPI design without counterbalances becomes a factory for perverse incentives. If you obsess over SLA compliance, teams will reclassify incidents to protect the clock. If you obsess over forecast accuracy, teams will sandbag the forecast so they can beat it. If you obsess over pipeline volume, you will get pipeline. It just won't convert. So KPI as decision rule doesn't mean punish people with numbers. It means enforce intent with paired rules. One KPI for the target behavior and one for the side effects you refuse to tolerate. Throughput paired with quality, speed paired with risk, growth paired with margin, automation paired with false positive rate. Because you are not building a report, you are building a behavioral system. And systems drift toward whatever is easiest to satisfy unless you encode constraints that force the system to stay honest. That's the entire point of deterministic decision-making, to stop renegotiating intent every week, to stop letting convenience override policy, to stop pretending that visibility is governance. So when someone says we need KPIs, the correct follow-up isn't which metrics, it's which decisions must become non-negotiable? Because that is what a KPI really is, a decision rule the organization commits to in advance, backed by ownership, time constraints, and an enforcement path that doesn't require a meeting to exist. And once you accept that definition, the next question becomes inevitable. What are the minimum non-negotiables a KPI needs before you're allowed to call it a KPI at all? The 5 non-negotiables of a deterministic decision engine. So here they are, the 5 non-negotiables. Not best practices, not it depends. The minimum structure required before a KPI stops being a decorative metric and becomes a deterministic decision rule. And yes, this is the part where most organizations get uncomfortable because each non-negotiable removes a kind of freedom. And organizations love freedom, right up until that freedom turns into drift, delay, and plausible deniability. Non-negotiable one is trigger definition. A trigger is not if it gets worse, or if it trends down, or my personal favorite, if we start to see a decline. That is not a trigger. That's a future argument. A trigger is a precise condition, threshold, duration, and context constraints. Threshold means you commit to a number. Duration means you commit to how long the number must persist before action. Context means you commit to scope, which segment, region, product line, severity, or customer tier qualifies. If forecast variance exceeds -7% for 10 business days in EMEA enterprise accounts. Now the system knows what bad means. More importantly, humans don't get to redefine bad in the meeting to match the story they want to tell. Non-negotiable too is ownership lock. Not finance owns revenue. Not IT owns incidents. Those are departments. Departments are how accountability goes to die. A deterministic decision engine has one accountable role per trigger. 1. A named function, not a distribution list. The VP of Revenue Operations. The incident commander role. The service owner for a specific product. And ownership is not responsible for reporting. Ownership means the trigger creates an obligation on that role to execute the pre-committed action or to file an exception that is visible, timestamped, and explainable. If you can't point to one accountable role, the system has already chosen politics over determinism. Non-negotiable 3 is pre-committed action. This is the one that exposes whether you're serious. If a KPI turning red results in let's schedule time to discuss, you have built a notification system, not a decision system. A decision engine has actions attached in advance. When the trigger fires, the next move is already defined. The meeting, if it happens at all, is for exception handling, not for inventing the response from scratch. For forecast variance, pre-committed actions might include freeze discretionary spend above a defined threshold, reallocate a defined portion of paid budget to the top-performing channel, trigger a deal acceleration sprint for late-stage pipeline, or force a forecast reset using agreed logic. For incident SLA risk, pre-committed actions might include escalate to on-call tier 2 after a fixed time, open a major incident bridge, automatically pre-stage customer communications, or trigger a known remediation playbook. And the action must be explicit enough that it can be executed consistently. If the action requires interpretation, you move the entropy downstream. You did not remove it. Non-negotiable 4 is time constraint. This is where dashboards quietly sabotage you because dashboards align to meeting schedules and meeting schedules align to calendars, and calendars don't care about risk. A decision engine ties execution windows to the risk curve. If the system detects forecast variance compounding, the response window might be 48 hours, not by next month's review. If the system detects SLA breach risk, the response window might be 15 minutes for severity 1, 1 hour for severity 2, and so on. Time constraints convert awareness into urgency without needing someone to manufacture urgency in a meeting. They also create a measurable property you can manage, compliance to the response window. Because if you can't act within the required time window, the trigger is meaningless theater. It's telling you the building is on fire and scheduling a discussion for Tuesday. Non-negotiable 5 is feedback loop. Most KPI systems stop at triggering and escalation. They fire alarms. They route messages. They generate activity. Then they forget. A deterministic engine retains memory, what fired, what action executed, who approved or overrode it, how long it took, and what outcome followed. And then it measures intervention efficacy. Did the variance stabilize? Did forecast error reduce? Did SLA compliance return above the committed threshold? Did MTTR improve? Did false escalations increase? This is where you move from automation to control. Because now the organization can tune decisions the same way it tunes systems, by observing outcomes and adjusting rules deliberately, not by changing opinions. If you skip the feedback loop, you create brittle automation that slowly becomes wrong as the environment changes. The system doesn't adapt, it accumulates exceptions. Exceptions become the new normal. And entropy wins again. So those are the 5: trigger, owner, action, time, feedback. They are not optional knobs, they are the architecture that makes a KPI real. And once you enforce all 5, you'll notice something that executives can't articulate but immediately feel. Meetings get shorter, debates get rarer, and the organization starts behaving like it has intent, not just information. Now, the next question is obvious. If this is the structure, what does it look like as a stack? Not as products, as layers. The decision stack: data, logic, state, action, interface. Once you accept the 5 non-negotiables, you stop thinking in pages and start thinking in layers. Because determinism is not a visual property, it's an architectural property. And the fastest way to explain it, especially in a Microsoft-heavy organization, is as a decision stack, not a tool chain, a stack, a sequence of layers where each layer has a job, and each job removes a class of ambiguity the organization normally tolerates. Data, logic, .state, .action, interface. If any one of these layers is missing, the KPI system collapses back into reporting theater. Layer 1 is data. This is where most KPI conversations start, and it's usually where they end. People fight about source, systems, refresh cadence, data quality, and lineage. Important, yes. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Even perfect data doesn't produce a decision. It produces arguments faster. Data's job in the stack is not to be available. Data's job is to converge into something that the organization agrees is eligible to drive automation, eligible to trigger obligation, eligible to get someone woken up at 2 a.m. If you can't say that with a straight face, you don't have decision-grade data. You have analytics-grade data, different category, different consequences. Layer 2 is logic. This is where meaning gets compiled, not inferred, not interpreted by the business, compiled. A semantic model is basically an authorization compiler for meaning. It takes raw facts and turns them into governed definitions the organization can reuse without relitigating them every week. Revenue means this, margin means that. SLA means exactly this time window with exactly these exclusions, and we're done. Without that layer, one-page KPIs becomes 9 different calculations that happen to share a label. The visuals line up, the meanings don't, and the minute you attach automation to it, you've automated disagreement. Layer 3 is state. This is the part dashboards never have, which is why dashboards can't be control systems. State is operational memory. A report can tell you the variance is 9%. It cannot tell you whether the variance trigger already fired yesterday, whether an action was assigned, whether it's in progress, whether it was overridden, or whether it failed silently in someone's inbox. A decision engine needs a ledger: trigger fired, owner assigned, action launched, status tracked, outcome recorded, exception reason captured. If you don't have that, you don't have determinism. You have a screenshot and a prayer. State also gives you audit posture, not we think we did something. Actual traceability, who changed what, when, and what the system did as a result. That's the difference between governance and a PowerPoint claim of governance. Layer 4 is action. This is where intent stops being a meeting and becomes enforcement. Action is not send an email. Action is execute the pre-committed pathway, escalate to the accountable role, create the work item, apply the spend guardrail, trigger the remediation playbook, route approvals only where risk demands human judgment, and log everything. And yes, this is where organizations panic because action removes the ability to delay. It removes the ability to get alignment as a substitute for doing the work. But that's the point. The system should only escalate to humans when the system cannot decide. Everything else is automation because everything else is repeatable. Layer 5 is interface. And this is where the one-page KPI fantasy belongs, at the end, not the beginning. The interface is how executives access the decision engine. Sometimes that's a dashboard, sometimes it's a scorecard. Increasingly, it's conversational. Are we within our risk tolerance? Which triggers fired this week? What actions are overdue, and who owns them? Here's the key constraint. The interface must query decisions, not data sets. If the interface lets leaders wander through raw data, you just rebuilt the debate loop in a nicer wrapper. If the interface surfaces decision state, what the system concluded, what it did, what's pending, you've finally given them the control plane they were asking for badly when they said 1 page. So the stack is the deliverable. Data convergence eliminates contradictory inputs. Logic eliminates contradictory definitions. State eliminates contradictory narratives about what happened. Action eliminates contradictory response patterns. Interface eliminates contradictory access paths. And when you build it in that order, the executive experience becomes boring in the best way. Same condition, same outcome, same accountability. No interpretive freedom where the business can't afford it. Now we can map these layers onto Microsoft components without turning this into a tutorial. Layer 1. Data convergence. Fabric. One lake as entropy containment. Layer 1 is where most organizations accidentally sabotage determinism before they even get to the argument about KPIs. They treat data storage as an implementation detail. It is not. Data convergence is a contract where the organization agrees truth is allowed to live, how it's curated, and under what governance it can graduate from interesting to decision grade. This is why Fabric and OneLake matter in this episode. Not because they're trendy, and not because the UI looks nicer than the last platform you regret buying. They matter because OneLake is the closest thing Microsoft gives you to a single logical place where cross-domain metrics can be assembled without inventing a new copy of reality for every team. And yes, single logical place is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Because the failure mode isn't that data doesn't exist. The failure mode is that the same fact exists 3 times. Once in the source system, once in somebody's export, and once in the clean dataset that only one analyst understands. Each copy drifts, each copy refreshes differently, each copy produces a slightly different KPI, and then your executive meeting becomes a reconciliation workshop disguised as strategy. That is entropy. Fabric gives you a way to contain it, but only if you treat it as architecture, not plumbing. The moment you allow every domain to build its own lake, you didn't implement convergence, you implemented federated confusion with better branding. So the real move is this. Establish one lake as the where truth lives boundary. Not forever, not for everything, but for anything you intend to use as a deterministic trigger. If a metric can wake someone up, freeze spend, or escalate an incident, it does not get to come from a best effort pipeline. It does not get to come from a workbook. It does not get to come from, we'll fix it next sprint. Decision-grade inputs need an explicit life cycle. That's where certified data products enter the conversation. Not as governance theater, as anti-entropy mechanisms. The point of a certified product is to give the organization a trusted interface. This dataset has an owner, a refresh expectation, documented meaning, and lineage you can defend when someone inevitably challenges it. And without that, your decision engine becomes probabilistic at the first layer. You end up automating actions off a dataset that silently changed or refreshed late or started excluding a segment because someone tweaked a filter upstream. The system will still behave. It will just behave randomly. Now, there's a specific pathology Fabric helps you expose: inconsistent refresh cadence. Executives think refresh cadence is a performance detail. Architects know refresh cadence is a decision integrity detail. If one KPI updates hourly and the other updates daily, your one-page overview is a collage of different timelines pretending to be one moment in time. That's not a dashboard problem. That's a time model problem. And it turns deterministic triggers into traps. You think you're detecting forecast variance today, but half the inputs are from yesterday. You think you're preventing an SLA breach, but the incident state you're looking at is stale. So in this layer, freshness is not a nice to have. It is a constraint you have to declare, enforce, and monitor. If you can't meet the freshness constraint, the KPI is not eligible for automation. Harsh, yes. Also correct. Purview comes in here, but not as a compliance lecture. Purview is how you stop pretending lineage is optional. It's how you attach traceability to the data product so your future self can answer the only question auditors and incident reviewers ever ask. Where did this number come from and who is responsible for its meaning? Because if you can't answer that, you do not have decision architecture. You have curated screenshots. So the deliverable for layer 1 isn't a lakehouse. It's a convergence boundary with explicit eligibility rules, certified datasets, known refresh contracts, documented ownership, and lineage that survives personnel changes. Once you have that, the KPI stops being a negotiated artifact and starts being an input the system can legally trust. And now we hit the next inevitability. Even perfect convergence fails if the meaning layer drifts. So the next layer is the semantic model, the meaning compiler. Layer 2, logic, power, BI, semantic model as the meaning compiler. Layer 2 is logic, and this is where most KPI programs quietly die. Not because the math is hard, because the organization refuses to pick one definition and make it hurt. People talk about the data set like it's the truth. It isn't. Raw data is just facts with sharp edges. Logic is where you sand those edges down into business meaning, revenue, margin, SLA, churn, forecast accuracy. Those aren't fields. They're agreements. And agreements are what entropy destroys first. In this stack, the Power BI semantic model is the meaning compiler, not a model in the diagram sense. A compiler. It takes messy reality and outputs governed, reusable definitions that the organization can't casually reinterpret based on who's in the meeting. If the same term can mean 5 things, it will mean 5 things. And then your KPI one-pager becomes a distributed argument surface. So the job of the semantic model is brutally simple. One definition of the thing that matters. One versioned, named, owned, reused. One definition of revenue. One definition of forecast variance. One definition of SLA, clock starts here, stops there. Because the moment you allow local flexibility, you create conditional chaos. The dashboard still renders, the colors still flip, but the organization stops being deterministic. It becomes probabilistic. You get different answers depending on which team built the measure, which filter context they assumed, and which exceptions they helpfully embedded. And the thing most people miss is that self-service is not the enemy. Ungoverned self-service is. Self-service on top of a controlled semantic layer is fine. That's just people asking questions. Self-service without semantic control is how you end up with 12 revenue numbers that all reconcile once you understand the logic, which is another way of saying nobody actually agrees. This clicked the first time someone tried to automate an action off a KPI, and it failed in the most predictable way. The KPI meant one thing in the report and a slightly different thing in the flow that consumed it. Nobody did anything malicious. The system just did what distributed systems do. It amplified ambiguity. So treat measures as policy, not calculations. A KPI measure isn't whatever finance prefers this quarter. It's the encoded intent, inclusion rules, exclusion rules, time intelligence, currency normalization, treatment of credits and returns, and whatever other compromises your business has been pretending aren't compromises. Once the measure exists, it becomes a contract, and contracts need change control. This is where governance stops being a document and becomes a design constraint. Your semantic model needs a life cycle: draft, review, approve, publish. And when it changes intentionally with a reason you can explain 6 months later. Because if you can't explain the change, you can't defend the decisions that followed it. Now, there's a practical boundary in the Microsoft ecosystem that lines up perfectly with this, the approved for Copilot concept on semantic models. Whatever you call the flag in your tenant, the architectural meaning is the same. You're declaring a trust boundary for reuse. Not everything should be reusable. Not everything should be queryable by an executive-facing agent. Not every half-finished measure should become the basis for automated escalation. The approved model becomes the one the organization treats as decision-grade logic. It's the place where the compiler output is stable enough to feed the next layers, state and action. And this is also why you don't want your decision engine glued together with ad hoc DAX scattered across 50 reports. That architecture guarantees drift. Reports get copied, measures get tweaked. Somebody fixes just this page. And now you have logic forks. Forks are entropy generators. Centralize the definitions, reuse them, and make exceptions explicit. Because exception in the measure is how ambiguity hides. If you need a special case rule for a segment, you document it, you version it, and you treat it as a business decision, not as a silent adjustment that only one analyst remembers. Now here's the uncomfortable part. Semantics are where politics show up. People will fight to keep interpretive freedom because interpretive freedom is how they manage their own risk. If the KPI is deterministic, excuses evaporate. If the KPI is deterministic, ownership becomes uncomfortable. If the KPI is deterministic, the system can enforce consequences without asking permission. That's why semantic drift is inevitable unless you design against it. So you enforce semantic determinism the same way you enforce security determinism. Single source, least privilege, review gates, and auditability. You don't encourage consistency. You make inconsistency expensive. And once you do, you unlock the real payoff. The meeting stops being about whose number is correct and starts being about what the system will do next when the number crosses a line. But there's still a missing piece. Even perfectly governed meaning still doesn't create a decision engine because decisions require memory. Reports forget, dashboards forget, conversations forget. So the next layer is state, an operational ledger that remembers what fired, what happened, and whether anyone actually did the work. Layer 3. State Dataverse as operational decision ledger. Layer 3 is state, and it's the part executives are unknowingly begging for when they ask for KPIs on one page, because they don't actually want to stare at yesterday's numbers. They want to know what the organization is doing about them. A report can show a variance. It can't show obligation. It can't show whether anyone accepted responsibility, whether the response is underway, or whether the "we'll look into it" quietly died in someone's inbox. Dashboards don't retain operational memory. They refresh, they overwrite, they forget. And the organization uses that amnesia as a coping mechanism. If there's no durable record of the trigger fired and you were accountable, then accountability becomes vibes. It becomes whatever story gets told in the next meeting. The system becomes politically editable, which is another way of saying probabilistic. A decision engine can't afford that. State is what turns a decision rule into a trackable event with consequences. It's the difference between we noticed and we acted. And it's also the difference between we think we're governed and we can prove we are. In the Microsoft ecosystem, Dataverse is the cleanest place to hold this, not because it's magical, but because it's designed to be an operational system of record with security, auditing, and a schema you can actually defend. And that distinction matters. Fabric and Power BI handle analytics state, facts, aggregates, trends, historical slices. That's valuable, but it's not operational state. Operational state is about commitments. What decision was made, what action was created, and what the current status is right now. So what goes into the decision ledger? At minimum, the trigger instance, the rule version that evaluated it, the timestamp it fired, and the context it fired under, the segment, the service, the region, the severity, whatever constraints made it eligible. Then, the owner assignment, not a team, not a channel, not someone in finance. A role mapped to an actual accountable identity at runtime. Then the action, which action pathway was selected, which playbook, which guardrail, which workflow, and whether it executed automatically or required a human override. Then the lifecycle, status changes, in progress, waiting on approval, escalated, completed, failed, overridden, expired. And then the outcome, the post-action measurement. Did the variance stabilize inside tolerance? Did SLA breach risk drop? Did the system recover? Did the action reduce forecast error or just generate activity? Without that last part, you built an alarm system, not a control system. Now, here's where most organizations mess up. They store this state in the same places they store everything else: email, chat, meeting notes, tickets, random spreadsheets. And then they act surprised when nobody can reconstruct what happened during an audit or an incident review. Those tools are communication tools. They are not ledgers. A ledger is a place where state changes are explicit, durable, and queryable. It's where we did something becomes here is the record. Dataverse gives you that model. Tables for decision events, assignments, actions, and outcomes, relationships between them, security roles, change tracking, and most importantly, a way to make the decision system observable without forcing executives to become archaeologists. Because executives don't want raw telemetry. They want posture. They want to ask which triggers fired this week, which actions are overdue, and which ones were overridden. And they want a coherent answer that doesn't require a meeting to assemble. A decision ledger also fixes another quiet failure mode: semantic drift over time. If you don't store which rule version fired the trigger, you can't explain past decisions after the logic changes. Your future self will look at an old action and ask, why did we freeze spend here? And you won't know because the KPI definition has changed 3 times since then. That is how systems become legally indefensible. So the ledger has to store the decision context as it existed at the time. The evaluated value, the threshold, the duration condition, and the rule version. That's how you make the system auditable. Not by writing a policy document, by capturing evidence as a byproduct of execution. And it's not just audits, it's operations. In the revenue variance scenario, this ledger is how you prevent the same argument every month. You can see trigger fired on this date, owner assigned, spend guardrail executed, pipeline acceleration started, stabilization achieved or not. No mythology, just state. In the IT SLA scenario, it's the same. Breach countdown started, escalation tier triggered, playbook launched, communication sent, resolution achieved, and whether the system prevented breach or arrived late and pretended it was fine. This is the uncomfortable truth. Without a decision ledger, you don't have a decision engine. You have a report that points at problems and a human network that may or may not respond. With a ledger, you now have a control surface you can actually manage. Backlog of triggered obligations, aging of actions, override rates, false trigger rates, and intervention efficacy. And once you have state, the next layer becomes inevitable. Now you can execute, not notify, because there's no point in storing obligations if nothing ever enforces them. Layer 4, action. Power automate as intent enforcement, not convenience automation. Layer 4 is action, and this is where most KPI programs quietly refuse to grow up. They stop at alerts, they send emails, they post in teams, they create a notification storm and then call it operationalizing data. That isn't action, that's anxiety delivery. Action means the system executes the pre-committed pathway, on time, the same way, every time the trigger condition is met. Not when someone feels like it, not when the meeting happens, not when the one person who understands the report is online. In the Microsoft ecosystem, Power Automate is the obvious execution layer, but only if you treat it like enforcement, not like personal productivity. Because most organizations use Power Automate as a convenience tool. Route this form, copy this file, send this reminder. Fine, harmless. Also irrelevant to decision architecture. In a decision engine, flows become policy actuators. They take a deterministic trigger and they enforce an obligation against an accountable role with a time constraint and a recorded outcome. So the first architectural decision is the trigger style. You don't trigger off vibes, you trigger off events. Either the analytic layer detects a condition and publishes an event, or the operational layer detects a change and raises a signal. But the point is the same. The flow doesn't check the dashboard. It listens for decision-grade conditions. And this is where the system either stays deterministic or collapses into conditional chaos. If you let every team build its own triggers, you'll get 20 variations of forecast variance and 15 variations of SLA breach risk. And your flow inventory will become another entropy generator. So you centralize trigger definitions the same way you centralize semantic logic, versioned, owned, and tied back to the rule that generated them. Once the trigger fires, the next problem is routing. Routing is architecture. Most companies treat routing as send it to a group. That's not routing, that's abdication with an email address. Deterministic routing means role-based assignment. The trigger maps to an accountable role. That role maps to a real person at runtime. And the escalation path is defined before the incident, before the forecast drift, before the meeting. If the response depends on who noticed it first, you don't have a system. You have luck. So flows should do 3 things immediately when a trigger arrives. 1. Create or update the decision ledger record, trigger fired, rule version, timestamp, context. 2. Assign ownership, one accountable role, not a committee, not a please review. Ownership. 3. Start the clock. The time constraint becomes a timer the system can enforce, not a promise humans can ignore. Now here's where people get nervous. Approvals. Approvals are where determinism goes to die because approvals invite debate loops. But you still need humans in the system sometimes because some actions are genuinely high risk. Freezing spend, customer communications, public incident declarations. Those require judgment. The trick is brutal. Approvals only exist where risk demands them, and they are bounded by time. If your approval takes longer than the risk curve allows, you didn't add governance. You added failure, so you use guardrails. Auto-execute low-risk steps, reserve approval for irreversible actions, and escalate cleanly when the system hits ambiguity. An escalation has to be a first-class outcome, not a failure state. When the system cannot decide, it says so explicitly. It records that it escalated. It records who it escalated to. And it records whether the human accepted, overrode, or delayed. That's how you keep the probabilistic parts visible instead of letting them hide in chat. Now tie it back to the 2 scenarios. For revenue forecast variance, the trigger fires, the ledger records it, ownership lands with the VP of RevOps, and the flow executes pre-committed actions like creating a variance response work item, applying a spend guardrail, and launching a time-boxed pipeline acceleration playbook. If it needs an exception, maybe a strategic campaign can't be paused, the flow routes an explicit exception approval with a deadline and logs the reason. For SLA breach prevention, the trigger isn't breach occurred. That's reporting. The trigger is breach risk threshold reached with a countdown. The flow escalates by tier automatically, opens the major incident bridge at the defined threshold, pushes the playbook tasks, and updates state continuously. No heroics, just clock-driven enforcement. And yes, this is where the system becomes uncomfortable because it exposes the truth. Half of what you call process is actually negotiation. Automation removes negotiation by making the default response pre-committed. People can still override. They just have to do it in the open, with a reason, with a timestamp, against a rule version. That's governance that actually exists. So Power Automate isn't there to make work feel smoother. It's there to make intent enforceable. Because without execution, KPIs remain what they've always been. Colored tiles that report failure politely. With execution, the organization finally behaves like it has a control plane. And now the last layer matters. How leaders access all of this without becoming report archaeologists. Layer 5, interface. Copilot Studio as decision access, not report search. Layer 5 is interface, and this is where most organizations commit the final fatal misunderstanding. They think the interface is the product. It isn't. The interface is just how leadership touches the machine you built in layers 1 through 4. If the machine isn't deterministic, the interface can only beautify uncertainty. And if the machine is deterministic, the interface's job is simple: expose decision posture without forcing executives to become part-time analysts. This is why Copilot Studio matters here. Not as a chatbot, not as natural language for Power BI, and definitely not as an expensive way to ask, what were sales last month? Copilot Studio becomes valuable when it acts as decision access, meaning executives query decisions and obligations, not data sets and visuals, because the executive question is almost never, what is the number? That's what analysts ask. The executive question is, are we inside tolerance? And if not, what is already in motion? So the interface has to answer in the native language of leaders: risk, posture, exceptions, and accountability, not measures and slices. If the decision engine is built correctly, the interface can respond like a control plane. It can say, these triggers fired, these owners were assigned, these actions are overdue, these exceptions were granted, and these interventions worked or didn't. And crucially, it can do that without inventing new logic. This is where people get sloppy and accidentally reintroduce entropy. They let the agent freestyle. They let it summarize the business. They let it do what probabilistic systems do, generate plausible text that feels authoritative. That's not decision access, that's narrative generation. So the architectural mandate is strict. Copilot Studio must be grounded in approved logic and state. It should read from the semantic model for definitions and from the decision ledger for what happened. It should not become another place where meanings drift. This is where the approved for Copilot boundary is not a nice checkbox. It's a trust boundary. If a model isn't approved, the agent doesn't use it. If a metric definition isn't governed, the agent doesn't paraphrase it. If an action isn't in the ledger, the agent doesn't claim it happened. This is how you keep a conversational interface from turning into conditional chaos. Now, executives also don't want one agent per system. They don't want to memorize which bot to ask. They want a single entry point that routes to the right domain. So you treat the interface as an orchestrator, even if it looks like one chat window. A lead agent handles the conversation and routes to domain agents. Finance, operations, security, HR, whatever you can defend. And each domain agent is constrained by its data products, its semantic definitions, and its permitted actions. That last part matters, not what it can read, what it is allowed to do, because Copilot everywhere without intent boundaries becomes unauditable. You end up with an assistant that can see everything, say anything, and suggest actions that aren't tied to pre-committed rules. That's not empowerment, that's liability. So the interface needs explicit guardrails, allowed actions, required confirmations, and stop rules. When confidence is low or the situation is out of model, the agent escalates to a human and logs that escalation as an event. It doesn't guess, it doesn't be helpful, it stops. That's how the interface stays aligned with deterministic core and uses probabilistic AI where it belongs. Explanation, summarization, option generation. Never as the source of truth, never as the rule engine. And once you do this, the executive experience changes in a way dashboards never achieve. Instead of open the report and interpret, the interaction becomes, are we within revenue risk tolerance for Q3? Which variance triggers fired in the last 10 business days? What actions did the system execute and what's still waiting? Show me exceptions and who approved them. That's not reporting, that's governance with a user interface. And it collapses decision latency because leaders no longer spend time finding the page, interpreting the filters, and arguing about the number. They spend time on the only thing humans are still needed for, choosing between explicit, bounded options when the system reaches ambiguity. So yes, executives asked for one page. What they actually wanted was one place to ask, what's the state of our decisions? The Copilot Studio can be that place if you treat it as the interface to a deterministic decision engine, not a search for reports. Scenario 1, setup, revenue forecast variance, the classic failure loop. Revenue forecast variance is the finance version of an incident. It just moves slower with better suits and worse honesty. And it repeats because the organization keeps treating it as a reporting problem, not a decision problem. Here's the classic loop. The month closes or the quarter progresses and finance produces the variance report. Maybe it's a deck, maybe it's a Power BI page exported to PDF because someone still thinks the board is allergic to live data. Either way, the packet lands in an executive meeting as a statement of state. Forecast was X, actual is Y, variance is negative, and the narrative begins. Now the first failure happens immediately. The number arrives without obligation. Everyone sees the variance, but nobody is bound to a pre-committed response. So the meeting does what meetings always do when the system refuses to decide. It debates. Sales says it's pipeline timing. Marketing says the leads were lower quality. Product says pricing changes created friction. Finance says the expense plan assumed a revenue curve that no longer exists. Someone says it's seasonal. Someone says it's one time. Someone says the data's wrong. And someone inevitably says, let's monitor it. That's not strategy, that's latency, and it's not accidental. The system is designed to produce that outcome because the metric is not wired to a trigger, an owner, and an action pathway. So humans have to invent the response in real time inside a political room under incomplete context. Over time, that debate loop becomes a behavioral pattern. Variance appears, interpretation expands, responsibility dilutes, and action slips into the future. Then comes the second failure. Leading indicators exist, but they don't count. Most organizations have early signals that the forecast is drifting. Pipeline velocity changes, conversion rates dip, deal aging creeps upward, discount rates rise, renewal slippage shows up in account notes. Sales stages get optimized in CRM to tell a nicer story. All of that happens long before the forecast gap becomes undeniable. But because those signals aren't owned as rules, they're treated as interesting. They become charts people look at, not triggers the system enforces. So the organization waits for the variance to become large enough to be socially undeniable. And by the time it is, the only actions left are blunt instruments. Freeze spend, cut headcount, cancel programs, reforecast aggressively, or invent a new narrative about headwinds and focus. That's the third failure. The forecast turns into a story, not a system. Forecasting becomes a monthly storytelling ceremony where teams negotiate reality under the cover of aggregated numbers. The model isn't wrong, the organization is. It keeps using forecast variance as a lagging indicator, then acting surprised when lagging indicators show up late. And because the response is late, it's reactive. Reactive actions damage trust. They also create collateral damage. Marketing gets whiplash, sales gets pressure that turns into deal quality decay, and finance loses credibility because it looks like it can't see the future. Which is unfair because it usually can. It just can't enforce anything. Now zoom out to the meta problem. Forecast variance creates strategy thrash. Executives can't commit to initiatives because the financial narrative changes every month. Teams can't plan because priorities shift with the latest variance explanation. And each cycle burns organizational energy. More reconciliation, more follow-up analysis, more quick deep dives, more slide updates, more meetings whose only output is a decision to have more meetings. This is why finance leaders keep asking for a single page. They think compression of visibility will compress the cycle. It won't. A one-page KPI overview might show the variance sooner, with nicer formatting. But it doesn't change the response pattern. It doesn't assign ownership. It doesn't pre-commit actions. It doesn't enforce time windows. It doesn't store state. It doesn't measure whether interventions worked. So the loop persists. Variance report. Meeting debate. Delayed adjustment. Next month, repeat. And the most expensive part isn't the bad month. It's the 2 weeks of organizational indecision where everyone can see the drift, but nobody is structurally obligated to act. That's the real KPI, decision latency. Now, the only way out is to treat forecast variance like an engineered decision surface, not a finance artifact, not a slide. A decision surface, where leading indicators trigger deterministic obligations, where actions execute by design, and where exceptions are visible instead of smuggled in as narratives. So next, that's what we're going to do. We'll convert forecast variance from a monthly argument into a deterministic decision design, triggers, owners, actions, time windows, and feedback. And it will feel uncomfortable because it removes the organization's favorite capability, delaying reality with meetings. Scenario 1 decision design. Forecast variance as triggers, owners, actions. So let's redesign it. Not as a prettier variance page, as a deterministic decision surface that treats forecast drift like a controllable failure mode. Start with the trigger, because without the trigger, you're back to vibes. The trigger can't be variance is getting worse. That's a future argument disguised as monitoring. It has to be a condition the system can evaluate the same way every time: threshold, duration, and context. For example, forecast variance below -7% for 10 business days, evaluated on a rolling basis, scoped to a segment that actually matters, not the whole business where one product masks another, and not a region so broad it becomes politically safe. Pick the scope that corresponds to the owner's authority. If the VP of RevOps can actually influence enterprise pipeline in EMEA, then the trigger should fire there. If they can't, you're designing a trigger that produces performative accountability. Now here's the part people avoid. The trigger needs a pre-breach signal. Waiting for monthly variance is like waiting for a service outage report to start incident response. You want leading indicators that predict drift early enough for intervention to be cheap. So define a second trigger set: pipeline velocity drop beyond a defined band, conversion rate decay, deal aging crossing a threshold in late stage, renewal slippage count exceeding a cap. Each of those can be evaluated with the same determinism: threshold, duration, and scope. And yes, you'll get pushback because leading indicators remove the ability to claim surprise. Next is ownership lock, and this is where the architecture turns from analytics into organizational design. One role owns the variance trigger. One, not finance, not sales leadership as a concept, not the business. A specific accountable function like VP of Revenue Operations, because RevOps sits at the intersection of pipeline mechanics, forecasting process, and operational levers. Finance becomes steward of definition and audit posture, not the execution owner. Sales becomes a participant in actions, not the place where ownership goes to dissolve. And ownership has to be more than a name. It's an obligation. When the trigger fires, that role must execute the response pathway or file an exception that's visible, time-stamped, and reviewable. Exceptions are allowed. Invisible exceptions are not. Now, pre-committed actions. This is the real divider between reporting culture and decision culture. You don't want a meeting to decide what to do. You want a meeting only when the system hits an exception state. So you define action pathways in advance aligned to the type of trigger. If the trigger is forecast variance exceeding the threshold, the pathway could be 1. Apply spend guardrails. Freeze discretionary spend above a defined threshold until variance returns inside tolerance, with an explicit exception mechanism for strategic items. Not we should be careful, a guardrail the system enforces. 2. Launch a pipeline acceleration sprint. a time-boxed playbook, review late-stage deal aging, enforce next-step dates, remove stalled deals from late stage, and trigger executive sponsor outreach for a defined subset. Again, not a suggestion, a playbook. 3. Reallocation rules. Shift a defined portion of paid budget toward channels with demonstrated conversion efficiency or pause underperforming campaigns. The amount is defined in advance so people can't negotiate the response under pressure. 4. Forecast reset conditions. If the system detects persistent bias, it forces a reforecast using agreed methodology. Not because the number is embarrassing, because the model is drifting, and each action has to be executable, not poetic. If the action is improve pipeline quality, that's not an action, that's a wish, then time constraints. The window has to match the risk curve, not the calendar. For leading indicator triggers, the window might be 48 hours. Acknowledge, assign, execute, playbook start. For variance breach triggers, it might be 24 hours for guardrails and 72 for the first stabilization check. Time windows change behavior because they make delay measurable. If the owner misses the window, that's a breach of the decision system, not a busy week. Now the feedback loop. You don't measure success by whether people felt busy. You measure intervention efficacy. Did forecast variance move back inside tolerance within the committed time? Did forecast error reduce over the next cycle? Did pipeline velocity recover? Did conversion stabilize? And what was the cost? Did discounting spike? Did churn increase? Did sales cycle time extend? This is where you prevent gaming by pairing metrics. Recovery paired with margin, acceleration paired with quality, speed paired with risk. And all of this gets recorded as state. Trigger fired, owner assigned. Action path executed, exception approved or denied, outcome measured, rule version recorded. Now you have something finance leaders can defend and something executives can actually run, because the forecast stops being a story. It becomes a managed system. And the payoff is simple. The organization doesn't wait 2 weeks to decide whether reality is real. It responds inside 48 hours by design. Scenario 2 setup, IT incident, SLA, the dashboard that reports failure after it happens. Now take the same failure pattern and move it from finance into IT. It gets uglier, faster, and more measurable, because incident SLAs are where organizations pretend they have control, right up until the clock runs out and the dashboard politely confirms the damage. Here's the classic setup. A service desk or operations team produces an SLA dashboard, usually weekly, sometimes daily. It shows compliance percentages, breach counts, maybe a trend line if someone feels ambitious. Leadership sees green, breathes out. Leadership sees red, schedules a conversation, and that's the problem. An SLA dashboard is typically a post-mortem artifact disguised as a control system. It tells you what happened after the only moment that mattered, the moment you still could have prevented the breach. So it becomes theater, not because the ops team is lazy, because the architecture is designed to observe failure, not prevent it. The first failure loop is timing. If your primary SLA visibility cadence is weekly, you've already accepted that the organization will discover systemic breach patterns on a calendar schedule. But outages and degradations don't care about your calendar. They follow physics, load, change, and human error. So the system produces an incident, the clock starts, the team does what it can, and then the dashboard shows up later to narrate the outcome. Everyone nods, everyone agrees it can't happen again. Then it happens again, because nothing changed in the decision mechanics. Second failure loop, severity debates. Most teams act like severity is an objective classification. It isn't. In many organizations, severity becomes a negotiation because severity controls optics. It controls who gets paged. It controls escalation. It controls whether leadership gets involved. It controls whether a breach becomes a learning opportunity or a performance issue. So what happens? An incident occurs, someone labels it one way, someone else challenges it, someone waits for more information, and the SLA clock keeps running while the organization argues about the label. That debate is an entropy generator, and dashboards love it because dashboards only need a final label. They don't care how much time you burned getting there. Third failure loop, manual escalation. In reporting culture, escalation is a human behavior, not a system behavior. Someone has to notice the risk, decide it's serious, find the right person, get their attention, and then convince them to care at the right level. So response times become random, not because people don't care, because the system has no deterministic routing and no pre-committed escalation tiers. It relies on social networks and heroics don't scale. They create a false sense of competence that collapses the minute the right person is on vacation. Fourth failure loop, root cause after breach. A lot of organizations do root cause analysis the way some people do taxes, late, painful, and primarily for compliance optics. They investigate after the SLA breach because the breach forced visibility, but the operational truth is that the breach was predictable earlier. Queue buildup, missing ownership, stalled handoffs, unclear severity, insufficient on-call coverage, lack of runbooks, whatever the real cause is. The dashboard wasn't blind, it was just too late. And this is where the KPI request shows up in IT language. Leadership will say, I want a one-page view of incidents and SLA. And what they mean is, I want to know that breach prevention is guaranteed without me having to chase people. They want a control plane. They want determinism. They want the same thing finance wanted. When a condition is met, something is already in motion. So what does the one page become in a decision engine world? It becomes a breach prevention surface, not a breach documentation surface. The KPI isn't the SLA percentage. That's a metric. The KPI is the rule. When breach risk crosses a threshold, escalation happens, playbooks launch, and ownership locks automatically. Which means the setup problem in IT isn't lack of dashboards. It's the fact that the organization has outsourced time-critical routing to meetings, inboxes, and opinions. And unlike finance, IT doesn't give you 2 weeks to argue. The clock is visible, customers feel it, and once the SLA is breached, you don't get to retroactively respond faster. So the SLA dashboard becomes the ultimate wallpaper chart. Accurate, well-formatted, and functionally useless at the moment that matters. Now the redesign has to start where reporting culture refuses to go. Deterministic severity, deterministic breach countdowns, deterministic escalation tiers, and pre-committed remediation playbooks that launch before breach, not after. That's scenario 2, and it's where the architecture either grows up into enforcement or stays trapped in visibility and keeps calling it control. Scenario 2, decision design, SLA compliance as a deterministic escalation engine. So let's redesign SLA compliance the same way we redesigned forecast variance, as a deterministic escalation engine, not a weekly dashboard artifact. Start with the piece everyone pretends is objective but usually isn't. Severity. If severity classification requires a meeting, you've already lost. The SLA clock doesn't pause while you negotiate optics. So severity has to be deterministic enough that the first 15 minutes of an incident aren't spent arguing about what to call it. That doesn't mean it's perfect. It means it's rule-based. Severity becomes a function of observable attributes you can commit to: customer impact scope, service criticality tier, data loss risk, security exposure, and time to breach. You don't let how loud the stakeholder is become an input variable, even though it will try. And here's the part most people miss. Severity isn't a label, it's a routing decision. Severity determines who gets paged, what playbook starts, what communications are pre-approved, and how fast escalation happens. So you define severity like you define firewall rules: explicit conditions, explicit consequences, and no hidden exceptions. Now the trigger. The KPI in this design is not SLA compliance this week. That's a tombstone. The KPI is breach risk. So the trigger fires before the breach, not after. For example, if time remaining to SLA is under 30 minutes for a CV1 incident and status is not mitigation in progress, escalate to Tier 2 and open the major incident bridge. Or, if time remaining to SLA is under 2 hours for SEV2 and no owner has acknowledged within 15 minutes, escalate to the service owner. The trigger includes duration because flapping happens. One noisy update shouldn't wake people up, but a sustained risk condition should. And you lock context constraints so you don't drown in false escalations. Only certain services, only certain customer tiers, only incidents that meet the rules eligibility criteria. Otherwise, you just teach people to ignore the system, which is how entropy re-enters through culture. Then ownership. This is where IT loves committees. The team owns it. No, the team doesn't. A deterministic engine assigns one accountable role per incident state. Incident commander, service owner, on-call engineer, communications owner. Not because they do every task, but because the system needs one throat to choke when the clock is burning. Ownership also can't be static. It has to resolve at runtime who is on call right now, who is primary and secondary, what escalation tier is active. If your ownership model relies on someone updating a spreadsheet, it will drift. It always does. Now the pre-committed actions. This is where you stop pretending that escalate is an action. Escalation is a routing mechanism. The action is what happens once routed. So you define playbooks that are not documents in a SharePoint folder nobody opens, but operational sequences the system can launch. For SEV1, open a bridge automatically, page Tier 1 and Tier 2, create the incident record in the decision ledger, assign incident commander, start the breach countdown timer, and post a pre-approved customer impact message template for review. For SEV2, page the on-call, create tasks for the first diagnostics, require acknowledgement, and schedule escalation if acknowledgement doesn't happen inside the defined window. And you build guardrails. If the incident touches regulated data, the communications pathway requires human approval. If it doesn't, the system can proceed with pre-approved internal notifications and customer updates. Again, approvals only where risk demands human judgment. Then time constraints, which is the whole point of SLA engineering. You don't wait for end of day. You don't wait for the weekly review. You codify escalation tiers as time-based system law. At T-60 minutes, escalate from Tier 1 to Tier 2. At T-30, incident commander becomes mandatory. At T-15, leadership notification triggers and customer comms prep becomes non-optional. And if the system hits T-0, that's not a KPI turning red, that's an architectural failure. Either the trigger thresholds were wrong, the playbook was missing, or ownership didn't execute. And the ledger must record which one, because otherwise you'll blame process and fix nothing. Finally, the feedback loop, because IT loves postmortems and still manages not to learn. So you measure breach prevention rate, not just breach count. You measure MTTR, but also time to acknowledge, time to escalate, and time spent in severity disputes. Those are the hidden entropy metrics. You measure false escalation rate, because too many false positives trains people to ignore the system. And you tune the trigger rules and context constraints based on observed outcomes, not on opinions. This is the shift. SLA compliance stops being a number you report and becomes a capability you operate. Same condition, same classification, same routing, same escalation tiers, same playbook launch, same ledger evidence. And when leadership asks, are we in trouble? They don't get a chart. They get posture. Which incidents are inside breach risk thresholds, which are already escalated, which actions are pending, and who is accountable. That's what one page was supposed to mean. Deterministic versus probabilistic. Where AI belongs and where it is banned. Now we hit the part everyone wants to skip to, because it sounds modern and feels like progress, AI. And this is where organizations create the most expensive form of entropy. They take a system that already can't decide and they add a probabilistic narrator to it. That's not intelligence, that's conditional chaos with better grammar. So here's the rule that makes this usable. You build a deterministic core, and you allow probabilistic AI only at the edges. The core is where obligations live. Compliance, finance guardrails, SLA enforcement, access boundaries, approval thresholds, anything that can trigger an irreversible action, create legal exposure, or materially impact customers gets deterministic logic. Every time, same input, same output, same owner, same record. Because when a regulator, an auditor, or an incident reviewer asks, why did the system do that? You don't get to answer because the model thought it was a good idea. Where you need rule version, threshold, evaluated value, action pathway, and who approved the exception. That's determinism. AI does not belong in the rule engine. It belongs in three places: explanation, summarization, and option generation. Explanation means the system can translate a deterministic event into human language. Forecast variance trigger fired because segment A stayed below threshold for 10 business days. Primary drivers were pipeline velocity and late-stage deal aging. That's not the system deciding. That's the system reporting what it already decided in words a leader can consume quickly. Summarization means compressing state. 3 incidents are at breach risk, 2 are escalated to tier 2. 1 is overdue for acknowledgement. The incident commander role is unassigned. Again, not decision-making. Decision visibility option generation is where AI can be genuinely useful because it can propose bounded interventions. Based on previous variance recoveries, here are 3 action pathways that stayed within margin constraints. Or, based on similar incidents, here are remediation steps that reduced time to mitigate. But options are not actions, and suggestions are not authority, so the boundary is enforced with confidence thresholds and stop rules. If the AI has low confidence, it stops and escalates. If the request implies an action outside the allowed playbook, it stops and escalates. If the user asks for an exception that violates policy, it stops and escalates. This is the agentic autonomy curve in plain language. The system can be creative only where creativity is safe, and it must be deterministic where consequences are expensive. Now, the uncomfortable truth. Most organizations do the opposite. They keep the core ambiguous, then ask AI to make sense of it. So the agent starts stitching together inconsistent definitions, stale refresh windows, and missing state. It produces an answer that sounds coherent, and leadership treats it like truth, because humans confuse fluency with accuracy. That is how you end up automating the wrong actions, for the right reasons, on the wrong data. And then the postmortem says AI failed, when the real failure was architectural. You never built a decision-grade substrate for the agent to stand on. So where is AI banned? AI is banned from triggering escalations, freezing spend, changing forecast baselines, assigning severity, overriding ownership, and marking actions as complete. Anything that changes operational state must be backed by deterministic criteria and recorded in the ledger with a reason. The agent can initiate a workflow that asks for human confirmation, but it can't unilaterally execute state changes that you'd regret in court. And if you think that sounds restrictive, good. Restriction is how control planes stay sane. AI also doesn't get to invent lineage. It doesn't get to blend sources because it feels helpful. It can only cite certified data products and approved semantic models. If it can't ground, it can't speak with authority. That distinction matters because this is how you keep Copilot everywhere from becoming Copilot made it up. So the hybrid architecture is simple. Deterministic decision rules define when something is true and what must happen next. Probabilistic AI helps humans understand, navigate, and choose within that bounded space. The system decides. The agent explains. The human overrides explicitly when required. That's how you get speed without losing governance. And it's how you make AI auditable, by forcing it to operate on top of deterministic state instead of pretending it can replace it. Now that those boundaries are clear, the final question becomes implementation posture, not tool selection. Operating principles leaders can actually enforce Monday morning. Monday morning operating principles. So what does Monday morning look like when you stop pretending you're building dashboards and start admitting you're building a control plane? It starts smaller than you want and stricter than you're comfortable with. Pick 2 decision surfaces, exactly 2. One finance, one operations. Revenue forecast variance and incident, SLA breach risk are good because they force honesty. Money and outages don't negotiate. Now define the KPI as a rule, not a number. If you remember nothing else, remember this. A KPI is eligible for leadership attention only when it carries an obligation. So write the rule in a way the system can execute: threshold, duration, and scope. Then attach the 5 non-negotiables you already heard: trigger, owner, action, time window, feedback. That's your definition of done, not a visual. Next, enforce eligibility. This is where most programs collapse because they allow almost good enough to sneak in. If the metric doesn't come from a certified dataset with a refresh contract you can defend, it doesn't get automation rights. It can still be observed. It can still be discussed. But it cannot page humans, freeze, spend, or open bridges. Same for logic. If the definition isn't centralized in a semantic model with versioning and approval gates, it doesn't become a trigger. No exceptions. The whole point is to stop building systems that depend on tribal memory. Then build the decision stack incrementally, one layer at a time, without trying to implement Fabric or roll out Copilot. Those are procurement words, not architectural ones. Start with convergence. Identify the minimum data set needed for the trigger and certify it. Don't boil the ocean. Boil the single pot that will burn you first. Then compile meaning. Create the measures that evaluate the trigger and publish them as the canonical definition. This is where you'll be tempted to allow local variants. Don't. Variants are entropy generators with a friendly face. Then at state, create the decision ledger, a table that stores trigger instances, rule version, owner assignment, timestamps, status, outcome. If it can't be queried later, it doesn't exist. The ledger is your immunity to "I thought someone else handled it." Then enforce action. Wire the trigger to a flow that creates the ledger record, assigns the owner, and starts the clock. Execute a pre-committed pathway. If you can't pre-commit the action, you haven't designed a KPI. You've designed a topic for debate. And this is the uncomfortable governance move. Require exception handling to be explicit. Exceptions are allowed, but they must be typed, time-bound, and attributable to a human decision. The system should never quietly not do the thing. Finally, expose the interface. Let leaders ask for posture, not charts. What fired? What's overdue? What got overridden? What worked? And force the interface to answer only from approved logic and recorded state. That's how you keep the conversation from becoming a narrative generator. Now, how do you measure whether this worked? You don't measure it by how pretty the overview looks. You measure it by decision latency, time from condition met to action started. That's the multiplier metric because it changes outcomes across every domain. In finance, you'll see it immediately. Interventions happen inside 48 hours instead of 2 weeks. Forecast drift gets addressed while it's still cheap to correct. And because actions are recorded, the organization stops relitigating the same variance every month. In IT, you measure breach prevention rate, not just breach count. If your system escalates before breach and the playbooks launch on time, you should see SLA compliance rise because you stop discovering urgency by accident. This is also where you measure entropy directly, even if you don't call it entropy. Track override rates, track false trigger rates. Track how often ownership resolves cleanly versus how often it bounces. Those are signals that your decision engine is drifting. And don't miss the leadership point. This is not an IT project. This is organizational design with software. You're deciding where meaning leaves, who is obligated, what actions are permitted, and which exceptions are tolerable. Fabric, semantic models, dataverse, flows, agents, those are just the implementation substrate for a decision contract you either enforce or you don't. Monday morning, you're not asking for more KPIs. You're attaching obligations to the few that actually matter. Stop asking for one-page KPIs and start demanding deterministic decision surfaces, triggers, owners, actions, time windows, and a ledger that proves the organization responded. If this episode made you rethink how your org runs on dashboards, leave a review based on whether it clarified what decisions should be engineered next. And if you want to argue with me in public, connect with me on LinkedIn, Mirko Peters, and send me your worst one-page KPI request. Tell me which decision surface you want dissected next, and I'll pull it apart.